I never imagined a cheap orange extension cord would end a man's reputation faster than any argument ever could. But that's exactly what happened on a warm Friday night when my neighbor invited half the block over for a backyard movie, and everything went dark right in the middle of the biggest scene. And while everyone stared at the blank screen wondering what had happened, I looked at that extension cord disappearing through a gap in the fence and realized 6 months of patience had finally paid off. People always think revenge happens because someone loses their temper, but sometimes it happens because someone stays calm long enough to collect every little piece of evidence. And that's the part nobody tells you. My name is Ethan Marshall, and until all of this started, I consider myself the kind of guy who avoided conflict whenever possible. I live in a quiet subdivision outside Bloomington, Indiana, the sort of neighborhood where everyone waves while driving 15 miles an hour and where lawn care somehow becomes a personality trait. I work remotely as a systems analyst, so unlike most of my neighbors who disappear every morning and come home after dinner, I'm home almost all day. I hear garbage trucks, delivery vans, barking dogs, sprinklers turning on, and every conversation that drifts over the fences. After a while, you start noticing patterns, and patterns tell stories. When I bought my house, I spent extra money installing smart switches and monitoring plugs because I enjoy technology more than I enjoy golf, which makes me the weird guy on the street, but I never cared. One of those smart outlets sat on the side of my garage, facing the fence between my property and the house next door. It wasn't something anyone paid attention to because it was hidden behind some shrubs, but I could see every watt flowing through it on my phone. At first, everything seemed normal. Then my electric bills started creeping upward. $28 one month, $33 the next, almost $40 after that. I blamed the air conditioner, then inflation, then maybe an old freezer in the garage. I checked everything inside the house and found nothing unusual. The numbers still bothered me because numbers don't lie, people do. My next-door neighbor was a man named Curtis Nolan, a retired contractor with a loud laugh and the confidence of someone who believed every yard within 50 feet belonged to him. The first month I lived there, he borrowed my ladder because his was supposedly at his son's house. He returned it 2 days later with fresh paint on the side rails and acted like I should thank him for bringing it back. A few weeks after that, he asked to borrow my pressure washer for just 20 minutes. It came back smelling like gasoline with scratches all over the handle and an empty fuel tank. When I mentioned it, he smiled and slapped my shoulder. That's what neighbors are for. Ethan. I force a laugh because sometimes peace is cheaper than an argument, but I noticed he never offered his own tools to anyone else. Things became stranger after he joined the Neighborhood Improvement Committee. It wasn't exactly a homeowners association with real power, but the committee loved acting like one. Suddenly, Curtis walked around talking about community standards, proper landscaping, and respecting shared spaces while leaving his own trailer parked halfway onto the sidewalk. He criticized other people's fences while stacking old lumber behind his shed where everyone could see it. The irony would have been funny if he hadn't taken himself so seriously. One Tuesday afternoon while making coffee, I glanced out my office window and saw movement near the fence. Curtis crouched down for a second, looked around, then disappeared. It happened so quickly I thought I imagined it. Later that evening, my phone notified me that the outdoor outlet had been active for nearly 3 hours. That made no sense because nothing was plugged into it. I walked outside after dark and found nothing. The next day, the same thing happened, except this time I waited quietly by the kitchen window. About 20 minutes later, Curtis stepped into his backyard carrying a long orange extension cord. He knelt by the fence where one loose board created a narrow opening, fed the cord through the gap, reached around toward my outlet, and plugged it in like he had been doing it his entire life. Then he walked back, smiling while dragging the other end toward his patio where a refrigerator, fans, and decorative lights suddenly came alive. I remember standing there with my coffee getting cold in my hand, waiting for the part where he realized he was stealing electricity from another person's home. That realization never came because, to him, borrowing and taking were apparently the same thing. I could have marched outside and yanked the cord away. I could have confronted him in front of everyone. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I opened the monitoring app, renamed the device Curtis Log, activated detailed tracking, and saved every minute of activity. Then I checked my security camera mounted under the garage roof, the one nobody ever noticed because it blended into the trim, and there he was on video feeding that orange cord through the fence with the confidence of a man who had never once expected consequences. I leaned back in my chair and actually laughed because for the first time since the bills started climbing, the mystery was over, and another thought quietly settled into my mind. If Curtis was comfortable doing this in broad daylight, then chances were he had been doing it for a very long time, and if he believed nobody was paying attention, maybe the smartest thing I could do was exactly that, pay attention. For the next several weeks, I treated the whole situation less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a quiet science experiment. Because every afternoon around the same time my phone would send another notification showing power flowing through that outdoor outlet, while nothing on my property was using it, and every single notification matched a video clip of Curtis slipping that same orange extension cord through the loose fence board before wandering back to his yard like he had discovered a secret utility company that charged him absolutely nothing. The funny part was that the longer I watched him, the more comfortable he became. At first, he would glance over his shoulder and hesitate for a second before plugging in, but after another month, he stopped checking altogether. He'd whistle to himself, wave at passing neighbors, and then casually disappear behind his patio furniture while my electric meter quietly spun on my dime. Every evening, I exported the energy logs into a folder on my laptop, matched them with the camera timestamps, and added notes like a detective building a case nobody knew existed. I even joked with my sister during one of our weekly phone calls that I had accidentally become the accountant for a thief who specialized in electricity instead of cash. She laughed and asked why I didn't just confront him. I told her something my grandfather used to say: when someone digs a hole, don't interrupt them if they're determined to keep digging. Meanwhile, Curtis seemed to be enjoying one of the best summers of his life. He installed patio heaters even when the evenings were warm enough for a t-shirt, bought decorative cafe lights that stretched across his entire backyard, added a small outdoor refrigerator beside his grill, and somehow always had music playing whenever people came over. His place became the unofficial gathering spot on weekends. Families would bring folding chairs, kids would chase each other across the grass, and the smell of smoked ribs drifted over the fence until it made me hungry. More than once I caught myself thinking that if he'd simply knocked on my door and asked, "Hey, Ethan, would you mind if I borrowed your outlet for a few hours?" I probably would have said yes. It wasn't really about the electricity anymore. It was about the assumption that my property existed for his convenience. The situation reached another level when the Neighborhood Improvement Committee began sending little reminder letters about respecting shared resources and maintaining community trust. Curtis had become one of the loudest voices behind those letters. During one Saturday cleanup event, he stood in front of about 20 residents holding a clipboard and said, "We all have to do our part. Communities fall apart when people stop respecting each other's property." I nearly choked on the bottled water I was drinking. Standing beside me was an older neighbor named Linda, who whispered, "He's something else, isn't he?" I smiled and replied, "You have no idea." She probably thought I meant his personality, but I meant the folder on my computer that now contained hundreds of pages of logs and dozens of perfectly clear video clips. By early September, the total unauthorized energy usage had become impossible to ignore. The app calculated costs automatically, and every week the number climbed higher. $40 became $70, then $98, then $123. The money mattered, sure, but what fascinated me was Curtis's confidence. Human beings can justify almost anything if they get away with it long enough. I watched him carry extension splitters into his yard, adding more devices like branches growing from a tree. Fans, speakers, decorative lanterns, even an inflatable football helmet during opening weekend of college football season, all quietly sipping electricity that arrived through my outlet. Then one afternoon, I overheard him talking to another neighbor while I trimmed bushes near the fence. Next Friday, he said proudly, "We're doing a full outdoor movie night. Projector, sound system, popcorn machine, maybe 30 people if the weather holds." The other man asked if he had enough power for everything. Curtis laughed and answered, "Don't worry, I've got it handled." I almost laughed out loud because, yes, he certainly thought he had it handled. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the calendar while eating leftover chili, and for the first time I realized the ending of this story had just scheduled itself. I didn't want a shouting match. I didn't want social media drama or passive-aggressive yard signs. I wanted something undeniable. So I called the utility company the next morning and asked a hypothetical question about unauthorized electrical connections. The representative transferred me to a field supervisor who explained that if someone connected equipment to my metered service without permission, they could send a technician to verify the situation if it was occurring at the time of the complaint. I thanked him and wrote down every instruction. Next, I called a friend of mine, Aaron, who worked as a property insurance adjuster. Without mentioning names, I described the situation. He listened quietly before saying, "Document everything. Don't touch their equipment. Don't create a confrontation, and let the facts speak for themselves." That advice fit perfectly with the plan already forming in my head. Friday finally arrived with one of those beautiful late summer evenings where the air feels warm, but the sun softens into gold. By 6 o'clock, cars lined the street. People carried lawn chairs, coolers, homemade desserts, and excited children into Curtis's backyard. Through the fence, I could hear laughter, country music, and someone testing a microphone by saying, "Can everybody hear me?" Around 7, the projector fired up, string lights glowed overhead, and applause broke out as the opening previews appeared on the giant inflatable screen. My phone buzzed. Outdoor outlet active. Current draw. Significantly higher than usual. I looked at the numbers and smiled because every device on that entire entertainment setup was drinking power through the same hidden cord. I walked outside, carrying a glass of iced tea, and casually waved over the fence. Curtis spotted me and grinned. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" he called. "Sure is," I answered. "Looks like you've got quite a setup." He puffed his chest out with pride. "Took a lot of planning." I nodded slowly. I believe that. For a second, our eyes met, and I wondered if some tiny part of him suspected anything. If he did, it vanished immediately because he turned back toward his guests and raised a bag of popcorn over his head while everyone cheered. I returned inside, set my glass on the kitchen counter, opened the folder labeled Curtis Log one last time, and after 6 months of saying absolutely nothing, I picked up my phone and dialed the utility company's field office, calmly giving my address and explaining that unauthorized electrical access was actively occurring on my property at that very moment. Then I looked through the window as flashing service lights turned onto my street in the distance and realized the movie everyone had come to watch was no longer playing on the inflatable screen in Curtis's backyard. It was about to happen right in front of his house. The utility truck rolled to a stop so quietly that most of Curtis's guests didn't even notice it at first, because all eyes were still locked on the giant screen where the movie had reached one of its biggest moments. But I noticed everything from my front porch as the technician stepped out carrying a clipboard, and another vehicle pulled in behind him with a police officer who looked more confused than concerned, probably expecting some routine neighborhood misunderstanding instead of what he was about to find. I walked over and greeted them, keeping my voice calm while explaining that I believe someone was connected to my electrical service without permission and that the connection was active at that moment. The technician nodded, asked where the outlet was located, and within seconds spotted the bright orange extension cord disappearing through the opening in the fence. He followed it with his eyes, then looked back at me and asked, "Is this your outlet?" I said yes. "Did you authorize this connection?" I answered, "No, sir, I did not." That was enough for him to begin documenting everything. By then, several guests had wandered over, curious about why 2 official vehicles were parked outside during what was supposed to be a fun neighborhood gathering. Curtis finally walked across the yard with a forced smile that slowly disappeared the moment he realized exactly what the technician was examining. "What's going on here?" he asked. The technician pointed toward the cord. "Can you tell me why this equipment is connected to your neighbor's metered electrical service?" Curtis looked at the fence, then at me, then back at the cord as if he had only just discovered it himself. "Oh, that? Well, we've been borrowing a little power now and then. I didn't think it was a big deal." The police officer spoke for the first time. "Borrowing usually involves permission." Curtis tried to laugh it off. "We're neighbors. Everybody helps everybody." I finally answered, not loudly, but clearly enough for the people standing nearby to hear. "Curtis, you never asked." The silence that followed lasted only a couple of seconds, but it felt much longer. Some of his guests exchanged awkward looks, while others slowly lowered their drinks, realizing this wasn't an argument about extension cords anymore. The technician checked the meter readings, photographed the connection, documented the outlet, and compared the active load with the equipment running in Curtis's backyard. Then he simply unplugged the cord. At almost the exact same instant, the projector screen went black, the speakers fell silent, the decorative lights blinked out, and the popcorn machine stopped humming. The sudden quiet spread across the yard like someone had pressed pause on the entire evening. A little kid asked, "Did the movie end?" And somewhere behind him another voice answered, "I don't think that's the problem." Curtis rushed toward the patio, trying to restart everything, flipping switches and checking cables before finally realizing the only missing piece was the orange cord now lying on my side of the fence beside the technician's boots. He turned toward me with frustration written all over his face. "You could have just talked to me." I looked at him and said the words I had been carrying around for 6 months. "You could have just asked me." Nobody had anything to say after that. The officer completed his report while the technician explained that unauthorized use of metered electrical service will be documented and forwarded for billing review and any applicable enforcement. Curtis signed paperwork with a hand that suddenly didn't seem nearly as confident as it had during all those speeches about respecting the community. Over the next week, the consequences arrived one after another. The utility company requested my energy records, and I happily provided the detailed smart outlet logs along with timestamp security footage showing repeated unauthorized connections stretching back months. The estimated cost of the electricity itself wasn't life-changing, but after administrative fees and processing charges, the total became embarrassing enough that Curtis couldn't dismiss it as a misunderstanding. Even worse for him, members of the neighborhood committee learned about the citation before their monthly meeting. The same man who had lectured everyone about integrity spent the evening answering uncomfortable questions about why he had been taking electricity from the house next door without permission. Within days, he stepped away from his leadership role, officially calling it a personal decision, though everyone on the street understood the real reason. Life slowly returned to normal after that. My electric bill went back to what it had always been before. The notifications from my smart outlet became boring again, and the orange extension cord never reappeared through the fence. Curtis and I still see each other from time to time. We exchange polite nods. Nothing more, because some relationships don't end with screaming matches or lawsuits. They simply run out of excuses. Looking back, I don't feel proud because someone was embarrassed in front of their friends. What satisfies me is knowing that I never lied, never damaged his property, never raised my voice, and never had to invent a story. The truth was enough. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with dramatic speeches or clever insults. Sometimes it arrives carrying a clipboard, wearing a reflective safety vest, and unplugging a single extension cord while an entire backyard full of people suddenly realizes that doing the wrong thing over and over again doesn't make it normal. It just makes the consequences bigger when they finally catch up. So now I'm curious what you think. Should I have confronted Curtis the very first day and given him a chance to explain, or was waiting and documenting everything the smarter approach? If your neighbor had been quietly using your property for months, would you have handled it differently? Share your opinion in the comments. Tell us where you draw the line between being a good neighbor and being taken advantage of. And if you enjoy real stories about justice, community conflicts, and unexpected payback, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation, because sometimes the most unforgettable battles happen over the smallest things.